Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and I'm recording this intro well ahead of the drop of this podcast. As most of you know, I'm out on an Alaskan cruise. While you are listening to this, I should have just arrived back at my house, and I will most likely have my first bout with COVID. Hopefully for me, it's not too bad and I don't die. But if I'm dead or dying, which is highly unlikely, I'm leaving you with one of my favorite business episodes of all time. I caught up with Mike Adams a week before his retirement from the Salomon and Atomic groups. Over Mike's 45-year career in snow business, he's been behind some of the most important innovations in skiing, the shape ski being the most important. Mike spent his career in leadership positions, and the groups he led were always defined by unprecedented growth. From the SEX to the X-Scream to the Bent Chetler and everything in between, Mike Adams has made a huge difference in snow, and it was a true honor to have him on the show, as he was one of the first high-test executives I had the opportunity to meet very early on in my career. And now I'm able to catch him during his last days in the game. Before we get into it, I want to ask you to post any episode that you really liked on social media and tag me in it. Whoever has the best post this week will be sent a beanie and something that I get from Alaska, and it won't be COVID infested. I'm looking for ways to grow the show, and this is one of them, having you post, so please do it, especially if you're a regular listener that has social media. I mean, I really don't ask for much, but what I do ask you every week, and I'm going to ask you again, is to support my amazing sponsors. And they are Stanley, the 10 Barrel Brewery, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Elan Skis, and Rollerblade. Now, let's talk with an industry legend, Mike Adams. I highly doubt that you remember meeting me in 2001 in a high-rise building in Manhattan to discuss the future of inline skating. I was at K2. I had no business being in that room, but K2 had laid everybody else off, so I'm not bringing it up to really talk about me meeting you. I want to know why Salomon, who was a huge player and made arguably the most comfortable inline skates at the time, would get out of the inline market.
Well, as you may recall, Salomon's presence in the inline skate business was interrupted for about 18 months by, in fact, your alma mater.
Yes, I do recall it.
And with that interruption, it was starting to coincide. Their return wasn't too much before the beginning of the downturn in the marketplace. And ultimately, we had to make some choices on priorities. And for better or for worse, I was the champion of the let's get out of inline skate. And so probably some people have some hard feelings about that. But I felt and recommended to others that we'd leave it. And we did.
It's a business decision, and the market dropped completely out, so it was kind of a genius move at the time. But it was a counter-seasonal business for you guys, and you were probably doing about 200,000 units at that point globally. And the footwear element at Salomon was also starting to develop. So did the footwear element almost make up for the revenue that Inline was delivering at that point, and it was able to be a wash?
The footwear grew so fast in the early stages that it did overtake it. And I think that what was happening also in inline skate was that the price points were in effect coming down, because what happened was the feature set was being brought to lower and lower price points, so that, as I recall, you had the ABEX 7 wheels and all the fancy stuff starting to come down to $149, and then in some cases even to $99.
Yeah, I remember that.
It became really difficult for the margins and to put that much effort into it. And so, perhaps it could have gone on a little longer, and they made some attempts in some of the other areas, more of the freestyle type skating. But, ultimately that was the choice.
Will we ever see Salomon inline skates again?
I have not seen any indication that you'll see Salomon inline skates again.
All right. So with most of these podcasts, I have a pretty good idea of my guest's backstory. With you, I don't. I was going to talk with your brother, but he's in the North Woods of Minnesota fishing with no service. So I know nothing about your childhood, which is fine. But where did you grow up and how did you get into skiing?
Well, great. So my family, we grew up outside of Detroit. My father was in the auto business, and he was determined to make a skiing family in Michigan. And so we Started skiing myself at around 5. We did the trek up to northern Michigan every weekend and every holiday. And through our experiences there at the Otsego Ski Club, we got into ski racing. My father wanted to be also involved, so he became an official and that sort of thing. And one thing led to another where it really took. And so my brothers and I actually all left Michigan in our high school days and went to school in New Hampshire at the Holderness School.
Yep.
A lot of it was to go ski racing with Don Henderson, who was the ski coach, eventually was the head coach of the U.S. ski team at the 1964 Olympics. And I raced at Holderness for a couple of years. We had an incredible ski team. We had 3 Olympians on that team, 4 World Cup skiers, and had a tremendous stay there. Then left the East and went to Colorado to go to college and skied collegiately in Colorado, and started at that point to also ski coach with the Broadmoor Ski Club, as well as took over the Colorado College ski team and did some regional pro racing and worked in a retail store. And my career in really in the ski industry started at retail. And like many people in my generation, we went through retail. We then became ski reps. And then I made the leap after being a ski rep and being employed by a few companies to take a job full time in-house with Elan in Vermont, overseeing the ski binding brand that they were importing, which was Geze. And one thing led to another. And after a few years, and by the time 1992 rolled around, I became president of Elan.
Well, we got way ahead of ourselves, and that's a great background, but I'm going to take it back to Holderness. And when I think of
Sure.
boarding schools in the 70s, which I've never been to, but I've known a lot of people who went to boarding schools, and I think of a lot of male nudity without any cares, and a lot of pranks and a lot of antics. And what's the funniest shit you remember that happened at school that was just laugh out funny prank kind of stuff?
Well, I think it was the antics that we had in skiing with this group of skiers that we had, which we were all very close. And this was the late 60s. In competitive skiing in high school in the East and in college, many skiers had skied 4 disciplines. You skied, downhill and slalom and jumped and cross country skied. And some of our best moments were jumping because we had our own jumping hill, was served by a rope tow, and we were notorious for creating a lot of havoc on that jumping hill. People would go off and their skis would fall off midair. We'd take the hill back to school on our jumping skis and did a lot of damage in the woods. So those were great events. And skiing back then, as you know, was a little more adventurous in the sense that it wasn't as well known. But at that point, we were having a good time.
And when it's time to college, it sounds like you go to Colorado and you race throughout college and then you're into retail. But as far as your ski industry career outside of retail starts, from what I'm able to find, the first 2 brands that you worked with were Moog Bindings and Molnar Skis. And we're going to talk about those brands in a minute. But how do you get that gig in the ski industry? How do you get hired by Moog and Molnar?
Those days it was pretty informal and it was small. I was working in a ski shop in Colorado Springs, Le Ski Limited. And in the summer, I started working at a tennis specialty shop because it was just the start of the tennis boom. And this fellow walked into the store and he goes, "My name's Dave Barnard. I'm a ski rep. Do you want to go to work for me?" And I looked at this guy and went, "Yeah." So he was an independent rep and he had many lines. And he had at that point this very strange ski binding called Moog. And Moog was from upstate New York. They made a lot of machinery, but they also related to the family, to the synthesizer. And they had a lot of money. They invested in this binding technology and then bought world's smallest ski brand at that point, which was Molnar. And Molnar was based in Boulder. And I stayed as a ski rep with Dave Barnard for several years, but then was offered a position to move up to Boulder and go to work for Molnar.
So we'll start with Moog, and the binding is very unique, almost kooky. It had its roots in space exploration, And the
Yeah,
guys at Moog built the steering for the Apollo vehicles on the moon.
exactly.
And the binding looked like what you would find on a ski blade with a spring on the heel. Describe the binding
Yeah.
and how it worked.
So in that period of time, there was the fashion came where you had a select group of toe heel bindings, step-in bindings, Salomon, Look, etc., marker. But then there's developed this whole genre of plate bindings, and the plate was attached to your boot in some fashion, and the release mechanism, toe and heel, actually worked on the plate, not on your ski boot.
Huh.
So there was Spademan, there was Besser, there was Moog, there was probably around 8 or 10 when it was all said and done. They became fashionable for a short period of time, even a binding called the Burt binding, which was retractable. The binding released but was on cables. The idea was that it would bring the ski back and the plate back together, so you didn't really fully come free of it. But they had problems. And the basic problem was that once engineers like Carl Ettlinger started to test them, they had real flaws in how they transmitted loads to your tibia. And they created dead spots so that the binding would never feel the load. And after that came out, it became too big a potential liability to be marketing those bindings, and they all went away.
Well, then you end up going to Molnar, and the
Yeah.
brands, I believe, are connected, but I would think, are they two separate jobs? Are you with Moog at first, and then you go to Molnar, or is it?
No, they were connected because they had common ownership, but I was really attached to Molnar as they were the ski manufacturer. This guy named Art Molnar came up with the concept. He had been an engineer that worked in Canada. He designed the original Tony Seiler fiberglass ski and was quite well known in circles. He was Hungarian. And he established this company in Boulder and produced there. The skis were very interesting. They had really interesting properties. They were really all mountain skis. They had a lot of versatility, but he never got to the scale of being able to produce enough in A1 quality. And also, he never could find the resources to really back it. So it stayed in business, I would say probably 6 years, 7 years, but then went away. I left the company prior because I was offered a job to move back to Vermont to work for Geze at Elan, and I jumped on that opportunity.
Gotcha. Yeah, the ski itself, I was looking at a bunch of the marketing materials that I was able to find on the internet, and it looked kind of gimmicky with like plastic channels that ran through
Yeah,
the ski that
exactly.
were filled with air. But I mean, anything
Yeah.
that was plastic would be filled with air, I would think, in the middle.
It was an interesting idea. It was really tough to make. And the quality control, it was really difficult because they had to make that internal piece and then bond them together and as they put it in a mold. And it was really difficult. So it was a great idea. It had some fashion in Colorado. It picked up a little steam, but unfortunately, they just couldn't make a go of it.
And when you're a repping these two products and you're traveling around, you're still competing with the big brands of the day. So after
Oh,
your
yeah.
travel expenses, are you able to make some pretty good coin being a ski rep with those kind of brands? Or is it more just passion based?
That was tough. I mean, my needs at that point, as I was single and pretty footloose and fancy free,
Sure.
they weren't extreme. But, there was really one silver lining in the whole thing was I learned how to sell products that weren't in high demand. And, that taught me so much that it served me later as I went to big brands in order to really understand, how to get something going and honestly to be able to pitch things that people don't have at the front of their mind and break through with them. So it was a great experience to learn how to sell.
And then you move back to Vermont and you're with Geze. And
Yep.
with Geze, you worked with a guy that I'll call a binding nerd for a lack of better term, but Rick Howell is a name that
Yes,
in the
sir.
binding world is a guy I don't know, but he pitched me on a binding that he's working on now, and he says it's a knee-saving binding, and he seems
Yep.
like one of those really smart engineer types who always has a different idea of how to attach you to something. And what's the story behind that guy?
I'll give you the quick story. Rick Howell was at Gatesay under the distribution with Elan. He was overseeing the Gatesay binding division, working for a guy named Tim Jamison. And I was repping for them as well as doing my other thing with Molnar. Rick is a smart guy. And before he did the knee binding, which you're referring to, he designed a bike pedal and shoe combination.
The cycle binding, right?
Yeah, yeah. And he left he left the company in Vermont. He stayed in Vermont, but he left the company in order to start that venture. I was hired basically to take his place, though I did not have nearly the technical background or his engineering savvy. I was hired more as a sales and marketing person.
So it's your job to drive the sales for Geze. I mean, are you overseeing the
Yeah.
whole marketing group, or are you just a rep in the
Yeah.
territory?
Well, it was a small group because it was me.
Okay. So you're tasked with building the Geze brand in the U.S.
Yeah. Yep. And we were a subsidiary of Elan. So I was getting involved in Elan as well along the way. Eventually, we took over Dolomite ski boots, the Italian brand, to distribute as well. So we had a pretty good ski boot binding program going. My boss, Tim Jameson, decided to leave Elan in, I want to say, 1990 in order to become the president of Nordica. And with his move, I was hired, then promoted, and became the president of the Elan group, overseeing Geze and Elan and Dolomite.
So where does Montauk sales kind of fit into that whole thing? Because it sounds like you had a sales group, or you're like the U.S. distributor and you're selling stuff here in the U.S. Is that how it works, or am I all confused in that?
So as a subsidiary of Elan, we were looking to take on other products to build our revenue. And at that point, it was common for European ski companies like Geze, like Dolomite, to enter into distribution agreements with companies that were already established. So you were a middleman between the company and the consumer, and it was fairly common at that point.
Does that let you have your cake and eat it too? Because eventually you're going to become the U.S. marketing director for Elan and Geze here in the U.S., but you're also the distributor of their products. So is it like you're creating the marketing plans, you're selling the stuff, but then you're also getting a cut and you're not owned by the company?
No, we are owned by the company. And
Okay.
so we were reporting directly to Slovenia. At that point, it was Yugoslavia. Slovenia didn't exist at that point.
Right.
Pre the war in Yugoslavia. But no, we were a subsidiary. So, we were trying to build our own capital base so that we were self-sufficient. But at the same time, the company was interested in making sure that we were financially capable, that we were creating value for them.
Eventually, does it get to the point where you have other reps working under you, where you're not just the one dude?
I was the one dude for marketing for Geze internally. We always had 12 reps in the field.
Okay.
So that was always common. And that's, what K2 did. That's what everyone did.
For sure. And being a rep in the 80s, I would think that's a total rock star job. You roll into every resort and city that you go to. People want to show you a good time. And I can imagine it's just a party all the time and then business during the day.
It was, and there were, I'd have to say, in that period, there were quite a few excesses that I believe were happening. Of course, I wasn't participating, in any of it, but it was fun. It was a lot of fun then.
It's time for my first sponsor break, and I'm going to start things off with Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. This summer, make Peter Glenn your one-stop shop for all of your fun needs. Think everything you'll want or need for wakeboarding, inline skating, hiking, swimming. You get the idea. Peter Glenn has the best brands at the lowest prices. And if you find a lower price from a reputable storefront, Peter Glenn will match that price. There's a reason Peter Glenn has been around for over 60 years, and that's because they're the best. To find out more, head on over to peterglenn.com. My next sponsor is Rollerblade, and they pretty much invented the sport of inline skating, and it's no surprise that they make the most comfortable, high-performance skates out there. If you're already a skater, check out the fit and finish of the 22 Rollerblade line. It will have you skating further and faster than ever before. If you're a new skater, Rollerblade has you covered with skates that are engineered to keep you comfortable, having fun, and most importantly, in control. To find out more about the 2022 offering, head on over to rollerblade.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley, the brand famous for that iconic bottle that kept your grandfather's coffee hot and his water ice cold. Well, Stanley still has that bottle, but they also have everything you're going to need this summer to go camping. Nothing else matches the quality of Stanley, and like your grandpa's water bottle, The camping cookware will last you a lifetime and create the memories that Stanley is proud to be a part of. I'm going to save you 30% on all of your Stanley gear. That's the best deal you're going to find anywhere. Head on over to stanley1913.com, go shopping, and enter the code DRINKFAST. That's all one word, all lowercase, when you check out, and you'll get the Powell Movement deal. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. It was also a huge time for innovation in skiing, and it all starts with your engineers, Jure Franco and Pavel Skofik, and their new designs that they put on a GS race ski. And the shape was called Side Cut Extreme, I think, and it was a radical ski that was like 110, 63, 105. Did you guys realize the benefits of a shape like that immediately after skiing it?
So that was one of the best experiences I had in my career. So the backstory was that in 1990, we became aware that Salomon was going to enter the ski business. And, they were already in the boot and binding business.
Yep.
And we had some pretty good intelligence, and we understood kind of their direction. And while Jure Franco and some of the Elan guys were playing around with the side cuts and they were working on GS skis, we started promoting the idea of working on a Montauk type ski, which had a one top sheet that went edge to edge rather than being a sidewall ski, as you can imagine.
Yep.
And that came to fruition in about 91. That was the MBX, which was monoblock extreme or monoblock X. In 93, I got exposed by Jure Franco, and not to be confused with the Slovenian ski racer Jure Franco. This was an engineer from Slovenia that was not employed by Elan. He was a free agent, but he would bring ideas to Elan. And he brought what you're referring to, a really radical shape for a GS ski at that time, to the company. They started testing it. They started building it. And in their first race in Australia in the summer, it was a World Cup race. They had 8 out of the top 10 finishers with the ski. So people immediately got attention and started to look at it. After that, I was in Slovenia. Jure Franco brought an even more radical design, which I had the opportunity to ski on in the summer of the summer of 92 on a glacier. And it was this gigantic, it was about a 203. It had a waist that was in the 60s. And you can imagine how it looked. It was just an incredibly bizarre looking ski with a lot of side cut.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to ski on it. And, when you ski on shape skis, one of the things people do when they were first trying them was they'd edge the ski and just wait for the side cut to turn and pull the ski around. And when it was built into that long a ski, it would do it, but you'd had to get going about 40, 50 miles an hour before it would be there, because you had to go straight for a long time. But once I had that sensation, I thought they really had something. So upon my return, I asked them if they would send me about 4 or 5 pair, even in that long length. When I started testing those, and if you've ever read Seth Mejah's article that he put in the Ski History magazine, he talks about it because he was one of the people I sent a pair to. I sent it to Bill Irwin at Sugarbush and Seth Mejah at Sun Valley, among other people, because I wanted independent people who weren't talking to each other to ski on it and see what they felt. And basically, all the reports were the same. And they came back saying, they can't really describe it, but they said, this has got an unbelievable feel. And once they hook the edge up, they can't be moved off of it. It was locked on. And with that information, I went back to Elan and I asked them if they would try to build it in a 183. And they did. And that was kind of the launch of the whole thing. Once we got that, we really knew we had something. And we went out and did a lot of promotion with ski resorts and with good skiers to get them to try it. And everybody came back with an incredible review of it and the idea that it could not only be a good performance ski, but it was a good teaching ski. And so we built even shorter lengths. I had the opportunity to go and work with Les Otten at Sunday River at the American Ski Company.
And that was huge for you, right?
That was a big deal because he wasn't a great skier and he felt the benefits of it and believed that that could be a whole new way to teach beginners because you literally could take people and start to move beyond the progression of a wedge turn and move them really quickly into a parallel turn. And he developed a whole regimen around introducing new skiers to the sport using that ski. So it was pretty phenomenal. It was written up in Newsweek. It got some play in the Times. Probably 8 different publications did articles on it, Popular Science. It was really cool. So it was a lot of fun.
So when this thing was developed, there wasn't really a target customer in mind. It was just like, we're going to change skiing with this and we have to figure out how to market and sell it. You guys knew you had gold in your hands, but you just didn't know what to do with it at first.
Yeah, I had 2 ideas. One was that in the shorter lengths, in a certain flex, we thought it was going to be the best introduction to skiing and the best progression tool to help people learn how to carve. For good skiers in a little longer length with a little more burly construction, it was for really good skiers, the best skiers on the mountain, to have the best carving experience. And, it proved to be right. We were basically had 2 models and we oriented it that way, the performance version and the all around version. And we went out to market that way and it took off.
And I think one thing that Les said about the skis that really helped change the game and helped you guys market it is he compared it to the oversized head of a tennis racket and how that's game changing for the beginner. And that was huge
Yeah.
for you, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you remembered that because I'd forgotten it. But yeah, that's exactly right. He did do that.
So from here, it's building the hype. It's telling everybody it's the oversized tennis racket. I'm sure your PR
Yeah.
firms have like a field day with that because it makes it so easy to understand. And how long did it take before the SCX was looked at as the most important innovation in skiing since Howard Head put metal in skis in the 50s?
I'm biased, so I think it was fairly quickly. But you got to remember that the design, you couldn't patent that. It was not patentable because it was a shape. It wasn't a unique material and a unique construction.
Sure.
So, as you know, I mean, K2 was right there. They jumped on it really quickly. So you had the K24 come quickly. They had Bodie Miller did some great things in racing with it. You had a few foreign companies, S-Ski, as well as Kneissl did some versions. And then the other companies jumped in pretty quickly. So I would say that what Elan did was they changed the whole pattern of ski development and they changed the direction. And that had a lasting effect. It changed the market. So they could stay ahead of it for a while, but as all those things go, they had competitors who had louder voices be able to come in and compete really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed to me because I was at Ski Chalet Tyson's at this point, and we were selling the SCX, and that was a great ski, an easy ski to sell to new skiers. But it seemed to me that Elan was almost pigeonholed as the cheater ski for new skiers, but too radical of a side cut for those who already really knew how to ski. And then the other brands came out with modified shape skis that sold better than those intermediate and advanced skis. Did that become an issue of like, how do we get our skis on better skiers' feet?
That's a good point. So, you know how, as things go, when you have something that was pretty far out on the scale, like the SCX, as far as its shape goes, companies came in and said, you know what? We're not going that far. We're going to go, let's say, halfway. And frankly, that's what K2 did. That was the K24. And your point's well taken that their argument became, we have a better mousetrap than the SCX. SCX had great results, but no, you're right. That was the evolution, and that took place. And then when I had the opportunity to go to Salomon, frankly, that's what I did with a ski called the Extreme Series.
Well, it seemed like when Salomon first came into the market, well, they didn't first come to the market. They were in the market with like the Superforce 9 and a bunch of stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it was time to shift into shape skis. They made the smart move and they brought you on. And back then, they're a standalone company in Georgetown, Massachusetts. I think they have skis, snowboards, boots, and bindings maybe when you came on. And the first ski I remember to come out of Salomon, which I can't understand the name, and to this day, I'll never understand the name, the Exendo series. And was that the first shape ski of Salomon?
It was. And so I arrived at Salomon in July of 1996. And when I got there, backstory a little bit. I had been taking the SCX around in 93, 94, 95, and, it was going. And I ran across at one point a gentleman named Jean-Luc Diard. He eventually became president of Salomon. And he asked me if I would give him the pitch. And I did. I gave him the pitch on the SCX. And he left the room, and we had a video that Jeff Bruce, Peter Kidd, and I did. It was kind of fun, tongue in cheek about what to do with the SCX. Jeff Bruce, Peter were doing full 360 turns, full circles on it.
I think I've seen that.
On that stuff. Yeah. And he watched it and he left the room, and I could see that he was shaking his head, not in a way that he didn't agree with us, in a way that I went, we got him. We got Salomon. So with that, they at one point went into disbelief. In fact, they had seminars at Las Vegas at the ski show where they were talking about the inappropriateness of shaped skis, that they really weren't all they were cracked up to be. So they were actually trying to market against it when the market was well on its way, moving that way. And when I arrived at Salomon in July 96, they had put the Exendo on the table. In fact, had gone to market with it. And that was their foray into shaped skis. It didn't work very well, and it wasn't particularly well accepted, and it didn't create a lot of excitement. So we were there holding that ski when I arrived, and we started to look for something else.
So the first ski that you really put your signature on and you're proud of, I mean, just hearing you say this earlier, was that the X Screen?
In the course of events, when I came into Salomon, we were obviously looking for that next thing. And there was a guy at Salomon in France named Nicolas Mermoux, who was a young buck in the ski department. And he was working with the team there to come up with a new concept. And I joined up with him at the hip, and we started working on it. He spent a lot of time in the US with me. We ran around to dealers showing them this concept and invested a lot, not just in the idea of the shape, but it was really the performance. We were really trying to come up with the best shape ski performance ever. And that was the criteria. And at the same time, we were trying to reposition it a little bit. As you remember, that cosmetic really was not sort of in the mode of what skis look like at that point. We actually took all our cues from mountaineering and alpine touring at that point. We were looking at North Face jackets, and they had one of their standout colors was this yellow parka. And we made the call to do that. When we introduced the ski, we didn't show pictures of people skiing. We had a picture of Chris Davenport with a pack on, the skis strapped to the pack, and he was climbing with the skis. So we were just trying to disassociate it. This was this new all-mountain hardcore product that we were bringing to the market. And ultimately, the ski, it was just an unbelievable skiing ski. And it pretty much had consensus, whether it was my brother who worked for Dynastar or Tim Petrick who worked with you.
Yeah.
They just were shaking their heads saying, this is really something. And it turned out to change the world. It changed our world at Salomon. It was really something.
At that point, I had moved to Christie's and Buzz's in Vail and couldn't keep those skis on the wall. They were the hottest ski on the market. And it seemed like everyone who lived in those resort towns were on X-Scream and then on a Pocket Rocket after that.
Yeah, and then after that, the Pocket. I think it's fairly accurate. In the period of when the Extreme was red hot, the number one ski in the country, I estimated over that time we sold 100,000 pair at $500 a pop. So it was about a $50 million program that we established with that. And it was amazing. It really was something.
Another program that was probably smaller, both literally and figuratively, that did really, really well for you guys was a category almost creating thing that you guys did with the Snowblade. Whose idea was the Snowblade? And was it one of those things where you guys just look like, I don't know how we keep selling so many of these and I don't see them on the mountain, but we sell a shit ton?
No, that's true. Yeah, Snowblade That was a French concept. The thinking at the time was this. Salomon was and is very creative. They let their, in many ways, people think outside of the box. And what certain people at Salomon were thinking about at that point was they were thinking about the future of what was going to be sliding down the hill. And there was a certain conviction that it was going to be, of course, skis and snowboards and things, but they had a conviction that it was going to be snow toys. And what that could look like could have been anything. It could be bikes on skis, it could be tubes, it could be snowblades. And that's where it really came from. And it was from that sort of brainstorming around snow toys and what people were going to be doing to have fun. That's where it originated.
And it's so funny that we had the same thought process at K2. I say we, I had no part in the thought process, but there were snow bikes being made. There was snow tubes being made. There was so much money being wasted and spent. And all we really need to do was copy the snowblade with the fatty and we'd be fine.
Yeah, Patrick, he was inspired by snow bikes, as I recall. He had a thing for those.
Yeah, I worked with Tom Beach, if you remember him, and he was able to get snow bikes on every mountain on the East Coast. So I snow biked everywhere that you couldn't snow bike back in the day.
Yeah, so that was really it. And what was nice about Snowblade was we spent a lot of time on the packaging. It sounds stupid, but I don't know if you remember, they came in a box.
Yeah.
And the idea was, and you may have experienced this, we thought they were going to be a huge Christmas item. So we sold them in those boxes with the idea they could stack them up. And it literally almost it came true, because they were $199. And we saw this surge of people come in and buy these at Christmas time at the holidays to go under the tree. It was amazing.
One thing I never really thought about, and it just hit me when I was thinking about the Moog binding, was that these things weren't releasable at all, and anybody could ski on these. And did you ever hear about a lot of leg injuries coming from the Snowblade, or did that not happen?
There were, because, as you identified, there were release on them, and eventually that became a concern. It became a concern not so much with adults, but it became a concern with kids because their tibia length and their size relative to the ski and to the distance in the binding was considered potentially to be not unsafe by that, but more of a risk. And eventually Salomon's decision was to stop production.
Okay. And I guess while those product categories are all exciting that we've talked about, the one that really changed the game for the youth market was the twin tip segment. And when you first got your hands on the Mike Douglas videotape and manifesto, what were the thoughts going through your head?
Well, we were all kind of blown away. I mean, I had hired to run our race program, but it became more than race. It became really our sponsorship program. A guy named Mike DeCicero, and he was at Dina Star. I lured him down to Salomon. And Mike saw that video as well. And he really said, we've got to do this. We've got to go. And at that point, Douglas hadn't had a lot of response, but we immediately went to France, and their inclination was to get all over it. Because again, I go back to this idea, they had people that thought outside the box, and it really struck a chord with them. And the idea of attracting younger and new types of skiers was incredibly interesting to them. So they pretty much jumped all over it. And that's when Mike, he became directly involved with Salomon. And to this day, he's still involved with Salomon. So it's a pretty impressive story.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and while ski season is coming to a close, Elan Skis is still supporting the show because they know how important the history of this sport is. What's important to me is that you do your part by checking out Elan's site, looking at their products, and demoing a pair next season. Once you do try an Elan ski, you'll end up buying that pair as the quality and performance of Elan's products is unmatched. I'm sure you've started to see more and more Elan skis at your local hill, and the reason is because they are more fun and they're going to make you a better skier. To find out more about everything Elan and their skis, head on over to elanskis.com. My final sponsor is the 10 Barrel Brewery out of Bend, Oregon. They've been brewing the best beer in the Pacific Northwest since 2006, and they've been banging the drum about drinking 10 Barrel outside ever since. But they don't just go outside and drink. They support athletes like skiers Kate Zelef and Lucas Walks and snowboarder Ben Ferguson, mountain biker Carson Storch, and many, many more. And they don't just pay these people. They give them beer, and they create content around them for all of us to enjoy. If that's not enough, 10 Barrel's Clean Line Seltzer has the perfect bubble recipe and flavors, and their cocktails in a can pack a punch. I love them. To find out more about 10 Barrel, head on over to 10barrel.com. Those are my sponsors. Now let's get back into the podcast. It's another area where it's like K2 and Salomon battling to be first, although Salomon probably wasn't battling to be first. K2 got to the market first with a shit product that was rushed and really didn't do that well. And while there may be a little bit of pride in being first, what matters is sales, and you guys absolutely knocked it out of the park with the 1080. I mean, does that ski perform as well as the X-Scream and the Pocket Rocket, especially at that point?
No, I would say in numbers, Extreme was by far the biggest, by far. Pocket Rocket was next, and 1080 did extremely well, but you got to remember the target audience was a much smaller group.
Yeah.
But I can tell you, for the sake of image and for the sake of notoriety, 1080 was huge. I mean, it was gigantic. So it was another, really good notch in the belt for the program, and it was terrific. As you know, I mean, it started things off. The origins of Line are that they started as a snowblade type company and progressed then into skis, and it started a whole group, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you can look at it too as all those kids that bought that 1080 back then, they were so impressionable, and that 1080 made such a difference to their childhood that nowadays they still swear by Salomon because it was so important to their youth, which is incredible.
Yeah, it was fun. I think back about what Mike DeCicero did once we had the product, and it was like we needed to talk to young kids about it. So we had the original group of the Canadian group that Mike had organized.
The Air Force.
With J.P. Auclair and J.F. Cousin and those guys. But, Mike went out and started looking at the younger kids, the little kids, and identifying, who he could get. And he came up with a great group of skiers, and they made a big impression on things.
And I think you guys have always been amazing with the athletes. It seems like spare no expense, but in terms of just the youth marketing program between Mike and then Jenny later on, all the best kids in the world were always on Salomon, and other people seem to be poaching from Salomon because it was almost impossible for you to keep all that talent under the Salomon umbrella.
Well, Jenny was an important component after she came on. Salomon, as you know, was a very important person.
Yeah, she made a big difference out there.
Yeah.
The one area it seemed like Salomon wasn't totally firing for, but I'm not 100% sure, is in the snowboard realm.
Yeah.
The market is very particular, and they don't like ski brands that much. Salomon came in with a very safe color palette. And how long did it take for Salomon Snowboard Group to become a success?
So I was in Salomon when we brought in the group. The history of it was pretty interesting because instead of just starting a snowboard line or collection, the first thing that Salomon did was they needed to get an expert in the company and a North American. What they did was they bought Bonfire Apparel.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
In order to buy Brad Stewart, who founded the company. And the origins of the snowboard was that because Brad was really a core snowboard guy, he brought a bunch of the real core snowboard retailers and influencers. He took them to Alaska and he parked them in a place where they couldn't leave for like 3 days. And in doing that, they had to hash out a few things. And the first thing they had to hash out was what they were going to call the brand. Were they going to call it Salomon or they were going to call it Bonfire? And they left that meeting and they came back and they decided to call it Salomon. What they had also decided was they had to make the Salomon snowboard unique, and they had to build in properties that absolutely made it ride differently than any other snowboard. And The tack that they took, which was interesting, was they went after the glide and the edge feel. And for those people that got on the original Salomon snowboards, the first thing they said, absolutely to a person, was this is the fastest snowboard I've ever been on. Because what Salomon did was they adapted the base technology that they used on their high-end skis and for the first time put it on snowboards. And frankly, the competitors said at that point, even though it was Burton and the other brands that were in it at that point, they didn't have that technology. They didn't understand what that could do. And Salomon snowboards, when they came out of the gate, yes, a very safe color palette. Remember, they were one color, either that bronzy yellow or the gray or the black.
Yep.
They were all very conservative, but they all had this unique edge feel and this unique gliding capability, and it really made a huge difference. So they had a pretty good acceptance right out of the block. The easier thing for them to do was then to go into boots because they had such a history of making ski boots, hiking boots, inline skates.
You guys know feet.
They know feet. So that was kind of the no-brainer at that point. But, it wasn't easy for a European brand still, I won't minimize it, to establish themselves in the midst of the American brands. And, that took time. I would say the real breakthrough, has only come in the last 5 years, to really get through that. And so it was a bit of an uphill climb.
Yeah, I mean, where everything else seemed to happen very immediately for you, it's like a 20-year climb in snowboard. But there is a lot more respect for the brand now. It's just taken a while.
Yeah,
but
taken a while.
While you were crushing things at Salomon, there had to be a ton of other brands that took notice. And I heard you came out for an interview to Vashon Island and K2 offered you a job. You get to the finish line and then you're like, there's no way in hell I'm taking that job. Why did you pass over the K2 gig?
To be clear, I'm flattered, but that's a rumor.
Oh, okay.
I was approached by a couple other European companies, and I decided that I was better served where I was. I will tell you, though, a story that's sort of ironic was that part of my job at Salomon was not only running the business for the Alpine and eventually Nordic and eventually snowboard as well, but it was also obvious to give market intelligence, to give trends, to identify competitors in our market and pass that along to the parent company in France. And I remember distinctly writing a memo that said, we have to watch out for this one company who had just introduced a year before or so this little ski technology called Betacarve.
Mm-hmm.
And then they followed that with a new ski boot, and they were in the binding business. And I wrote a pretty stern email saying, Atomic is going to be our number one competitor in the not too distant future. And it's ironic only because then I ended up later in my career running Atomic. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there was a lot going on and we had everyone chasing us real hard. And so it was trying to stay ahead of it.
So really, the only way you're going to go to another brand is with an acquisition. And Amer, the owner of Atomic, comes in and buys Salomon. What are your thoughts as this is happening? Because I'm sure you have to ease the fears of everybody in the Salomon building, as well as your own fears of like, what could happen to my job and our business?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're in Portland. We're with Adidas. And we started hearing some conversation around the fact that there might be a buyer of Salomon. Just to set the table a little bit, when you look back at the Adidas acquisition of Salomon from the Salomon family, it was a big deal. They paid a lot of money. They paid $2 billion for it.
Jeez.
And in that, the motivations for Adidas at that time was they were trying to get more diverse. And they were frankly also trying to get a really good golf brand. And Salomon owned TaylorMade.
Okay.
And that was part of the equation. But I will say this, the management of Adidas really never warmed up to the Salomon purchase. And therefore, they were not great champions. So it really came not as a great surprise that they would be looking at some point to sell the Salomon brand, keeping TaylorMade, which they did, but that they would eventually sell Salomon. And in fact, that happened. We didn't know anything about Amer when the announcement was made. We knew that they owned Atomic. and we knew they owned Wilson, and we knew they owned some other brands, but really didn't know a lot about it. But we knew one thing. The chief executive officer, the CEO of Ammer, was a former Salomon employee, and he was the country manager for Germany. He later left Salomon and became the CEO of Atomic. And he left Atomic to become the CEO of Ammer. So we had this knowledge that he was intimate with our brand and he really wanted it. So that was kind of a nice feeling that maybe we were going from an owner, Adidas, that didn't like us very much
Yeah.
to an owner that really did want us. And we felt like, we were Salomon. We felt like we were the bigger dog going into the company. So it was an interesting time. And I'm sure I probably underestimating the anxiety a little bit, but that's how we approached it. And as it turned out, I think it was a great move that Ammer bought it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it today, both brands are thriving. And when they come in, I can't say Atomic was thriving. I mean, you had mentioned the Beta Carve and you'd mentioned the new boot. But, in the free ride world, Atomic was really, they weren't anywhere really. And you're named the GM of Atomic at one point.
Yeah.
And the ski market was changing. Things were moving away from the park and into the backcountry. And when you came into Atomic, I think you developed a friendship with the recently departed, I'm sorry that you lost him, Rupert Hoopert, a.k.a. Keeley. And can you describe who that guy is or was?
Yeah, sure. Keeley was a veteran of Atomic. He'd been a racer. He actually skied on the Pro Tour a bit in the U.S. during the heyday of Bob Biatti and all that. But he was a really brilliant guy around ski design. And along the way, he did the powder ski for Wiggly, the original powder ski that Atomic did. He did Beta Carve. He was also a savior of the company because before Ammer bought it, it went through bankruptcy in the 90s. He was literally, they were making samples in Austria as the company was closed in order to bring them to Las Vegas to the ski show in order to try to build any kind of order book. And he kind of was the guy who kind of saved it along with a couple other fellows. But anyway, the bottom line was Keeley was a really smart guy and he understood design really well. And when I went to Atomic, he became a real supporter of what we were trying to do with the other management at the time and gave me the opportunity. When I started at your analysis of where Atomic was in 2007, Atomic was not doing great. They'd made a few key decisions that didn't pan out very well. The boot program was having problems. They were a bit stuck. And Ammer at that point, when they took over the company, took over Salomon, they asked me if I would leave Salomon and take over the management of Atomic and basically to reboot. And since they were asking, I thought it was probably a good idea to accept. I was always intrigued with Atomic because of my past experience with them and my feelings about their potential. And I said yes. And I took over the company. We moved the company eventually from New Hampshire into the Ammer Group in Ogden, Utah, in 2008, and that's when we started rebuilding it. And it was an interesting task. We were not doing particularly well. I had the opportunity, though, to kind of create a clean slate. And what I decided at that point was I needed to round out Atomic. We had a credible pedigree and acceptance and reputation in racing.
Yep.
And I decided at that point that what I didn't need to do for the US and Canada was I did not need to build more race culture in North America. What I did need to do was I needed to give them more breadth and I need to expose them to the more progressive elements of ski that was happening at that point where Atomic wasn't even present. And so I hired a guy named Jordan Judd, who you may know.
He's a genius.
As the marketing director for Atomic. Fortunately, he was already in Ogden, Utah, so it made it really easy. And we worked together, and I gave him a lot of room in order to help decide and craft what this Atomic move into free ski and the free ride could look like. And as you know, he immediately gravitated to find a few people to push into this world. And Chris Benchetler was the main find at that point, and then eventually Sage. And I don't think when we hired Chris, although I think Jordan had an inkling, Chris's potential hadn't totally been exposed about where he was in his creative abilities, in his artistic abilities, in, just what he has become. And I think it was just the perfect match of getting Jordan, getting him, and then eventually the Austrians. And they had a change in leadership where a bunch of younger people came in, including a guy named Wolfgang Meyerhofer, who looked at this and said, yeah, I think this is the right way. And he authorized us to form that relationship with Teton Gravity and get Sage and to move into more and more territory that Atomic hadn't been involved in. And it really worked.
Yeah, I mean, what he's done with the program is amazing. It seems like from the marketing perspective, it's like, let's get back to athlete-driven products and marketing. And you guys did that, listen to the athletes, or it made it appear that you're listening to the athletes, put that into the marketplace, man, and everybody loves what Atomic's doing. And, I put a lot of credit on Chris's shoulders as well, just because the art of what he's done is just he's got his finger on the pulse, and Jordan does, and you do. And it's just really, I guess, a synergy of all these great minds coming together. And that's a win for Atomic. Your final job is overseeing both brands, both Atomic and Salomon. In a position like that, I would think it would be really hard to be connected to everything each brand is doing because there's just so much stuff going on.
Yeah, it was interesting.
How do you even stay sane trying to manage two different brands and two different identities?
So I'll give you again a context of how that evolved. So Ammer, shortly after I started at Atomic, around 2009, at that point, the parent company, the Finnish company, they had a leadership group, board of directors. They were really letting the brands operate pretty freely. I would say that they were acting more as a holding company almost than they were as a company that was directing the activities of these individual brands, whether it was Wilson or Precor or, Salomon or Atomic, and obviously the others that they had in the portfolio, Sunto, etc. The board of directors of Ammer made a decision in 2009 to have a change in leadership. They basically cleaned house, and they brought in a guy named Heikki Takala, who was a regional manager in Europe for Procter & Gamble. And if you've read much about, which I'm sure you have, gotten familiar with Procter & Gamble, they are a portfolio company. How many brands of any one item do they own? Quite a few, right?
Right.
And their whole idea is to run the portfolio of brands. And so the idea of portfolio management was injected into Ammer, and they became very hands-on in their direction of the brands and the operation. So what that meant for Winter Sports Equipment is they wanted one management group to oversee the two brands, Salomon and Atomic, though they had individual leaders for each, and they had some very distinct rules, which not only I adopted, but I initiated to some degree, that they executed. So I was asked in about 2012 to become the leader of both brands in North America. And we did that. But I had to carefully lay out ground rules. And the number one ground rule was, although we had common ownership, Salomon and Atomic had to compete in the marketplace. If we were trying to direct these two brands to be cooperative in the sense of, well, you take this side of the market, I'll take that side of the market, it was going to be a failure. They had to compete. Now, were they going to be smart? Of course. They weren't going to compete against each other on a rental deal. They weren't going to go toe-to-toe on certain things, but they had their own distinct glide path and building blocks. They had their own design. They had their own positioning. They had their own brand vision and mission. That was the line we couldn't cross. And behind the scenes, yeah, we shared all the back office. We shared all the common things that you would if you're a portfolio. In fact, the other companies like K2 and Rosignol Group and the Technica Group. That's what they do now.
Yeah, I hated the whole synergy stuff.
Yeah, the, you know that, leverage the portfolio. But we had to operate that way. And what I tried to do always was to hire really smart people for each brand and let them be the stewards of those brands while I was more or less trying to stay involved to the extent of guiding them, of giving them good advice and making sure that the portfolio was heading in the right direction. And it was interesting, but it worked pretty well. In fact, we ended up with another brand, when we took over Armada,
Yep.
and it worked well. Now, having said that, with the new owners of Amber, their direction became much more in the last 12 to 18 months, much more brand focused again. And so that portfolio system no longer exists. And as I was going to leave at the end of 21 and stay in my consulting role, which ends next week, there was the agreement that I would stay in place over both brands, but when I left, they would be totally brand direct again. And that is, in fact, where they are.
Wow. So I was going to bring up that the brand was purchased by a Chinese brand and that was a big story for like a week. And then everybody forgot about it, just like other companies building stuff over in China. People complained about it and then they forget about it really quick. But they take over. They're going to switch things back to independent brands running the show for their own brands. And you are out the door. You've had a 45-year career in ski. And every step of the way, it's really been a whole bunch of tremendous growth, except for maybe Moog and Molnar, but that's where you learn.
Yeah.
What's next for Mike Adams? Are you just going to ride off into the sunset and go fishing with your brother?
I hope to go fishing with my brother. That's clear. And I'm absolutely going to be doing a lot of skiing at Snow Basin, at Park City, Deer Valley, and in Little Cottonwood Canyon. So that's a given. But it's a good question. I think for me, I thought that this was the appropriate point in time as they were changing into this new world, that it really was a good coincidence as the Amber Group was evolving and I was developing in my career, in my life, that this would be the great perfect time to separate. So I had a 6-month transition that expires at the end of this month. I'm keeping my world open. I have plans just on a personal level to do some volunteer work in the community, to spend a lot of time outdoors, considering, options to help and advise perhaps small companies or other companies in the space that I've been in for the last 45 years. That would be a possibility, though I'm not sure that there's a lot of demand for that, but I'm open to it. One thing I did, Mike, which I had some fun with, I wanted to research really how many ski brands there were in the world. And I spent some time in the last few months, among other things, doing that. I ran across a guy in Europe who also had some lot of information about it I collaborated with. But we've identified now over 115 ski brands in the world.
Whoa.
Most are based in North America. Most are craft companies that produce on a very limited basis, either in small batches or, made to order. They're all functioning because you can transact with all these companies pretty much now. And so that provided me with a real interesting insight into what the ski world looks like. They're all direct to consumer, pretty much. And where there's about maybe 16 brands that are known, sort of in the marketplace now, or, maybe a few more than that, there's all these other brands out there, which it's really fascinating to see. You've had all this consolidation, whether it's in the K2 group, whether it's in the Rosnell group, whether it's in the Ammer group, whether it's in the Technica group, and then you throw Burton in on top of that. You got 5 companies that are doing 75% of all the winter sports equipment business in North America. But you've got all these other companies that are somehow crafting a business for what remains. So it's pretty interesting.
It's amazing that it's a totally different landscape than when you started, when there was 15 ski brands and nobody could sell direct at all unless you were doing it out of your trunk in a parking lot.
Yeah, well, for me, it was even an awakening to see how much of the business now is direct to consumer that the big brands really aren't even tracking.
Yeah.
It was really interesting because I'm assuming with this many that there's probably in the US alone over 100,000 pairs of skis going into the market that nobody's really understanding at this point.
No one's ever said the SIA gets the best data. At least I've never heard that.
Yeah, so I have been working on that as well, and I'm hopeful that the work I'm doing with SIA and NPD is going to bear fruit because I think we're going to be able to generate better data. And so I'm optimistic about that. But you're right. We need more data and better data for the companies to plan their business with.
All right. Well, Mike, we are now at the time in the podcast that I call inappropriate questions. And I usually get someone that you know to ask 3 questions, and they can be anything. I tried to line up your brother, but he was fishing, like I said. My other people fell through. And I did talk to some people who wanted to be off the record. So I do have 3 questions to ask you. And I'm going to start with the first one right now. You have promoted and sold a lot of products in your day. Have you ever promoted a product with less credibility than Molnar skis and Moog bindings? And if not, what do you have to say about the BBR?
Well, I have this to say. I have not sold any 2 products with less acceptance and frankly less success than Moog and Molnar. So I will fall on the sword with that. But as far as the BBR goes, I will claim at that point I was GM of Atomic and I had no say into the BBR in the development, the launch, or the outcome of it. I did have to, at one point, clean out a few pair that were remaining in our inventory and in our service center. So I will have to say that I did sell the very last pairs of BBR in North America.
Well, at least you closed the chapter on that ski, not opened it. I will go into question number 2. You were retail's worst nightmare at one time. I think Salomon was one of the first to go direct, and retailers were pissed. At one buying group, an outspoken member said something to the effect that it feels like you're fucking my wife. And I'm sure you took it on the chin a lot for making that call. What was the worst of that?
Well, I'll backtrack on that a little bit as well. So in 2012, we started looking at a way of going to direct to consumer that would have been palatable in the marketplace. And that was palatable being what you referred to was the tremendous resistance of the brick and mortar community to any company going direct. And through a course of events with the team at Ammer, frankly, we actually devised a fairly creative go-to-market plan on direct to consumer that involved the retailer in the transaction. We registered a name. It was called SkiLink. We worked with retailers from the buying groups as well as representatives. At that point, the National Ski Retailers Association was formed. And we developed a program where we were actually going to be providing a revenue share program with these retailers. It still wasn't their favorite thing. And frankly, it never came to fruition because at the end of the day, the investment for Ammer to come up with a platform would have been far excessive of the return that they would have gotten quickly. So that went on hold. And actually, Ammer stayed out of the direct to consumer space until Salomon launched this past year.
Okay.
So it's only been in 2022 that Salomon went direct to consumer. They did a really great job. They do have a revenue share capability with retailers. And frankly, with the market the way it is, they exercised not only a very creative program, but a very disciplined and respectful program in the market. And my hat's off to them. They did a great job.
So back then in 2012, you ended up just pissing people off, but not actually following through?
Yeah, we didn't launch. K2 did that for us. They launched and then pulled out, but we talked about it. We showed a demo, but we never pulled the trigger. So I would say it's fair to say we got people's attention because we weren't trying to hide it, but we never rolled it out. We still have the name. I love SkiLink. We kept the registration of it, but never launched the program.
All right, I'm going to go into my final inappropriate question.
Sure.
And the ski industry is a fun place. Between sales meetings and marketing and trade shows, there are a lot of expense accounts, a lot of booze, and I'm sure a lot of other stuff depending on the crowd. And while I believe you've been sober forever, you were in the shit for a while. And I think there was a life-changing trade show in the 80s, and I've tried to get some details from a few people, but they're vague. But what I was able to get, that you were found in a rental car that might have been dinged up. Can you tell the story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's part of my life. I mean, Vegas, as you know, was an area that probably brought out excesses in a lot of ways for a lot of people.
It was awesome.
I'm not an exception. Probably had one of my wilder moments at a trade show in the 80s, in the early 80s, actually, because I started going in 1975. I decided that it was a good idea. Had an inopportune moment driving in Vegas that I would leave the ski business and go to Hawaii. And I did that and stayed in Hawaii for several days. And that became a moment of reckoning for me. And at that point, decided that that probably wasn't my best move. I came back to Vegas, was taken under the wing of a few great people, and ultimately it led to my being hired at Elan through the graces of a guy named Tim Jameson. So for me, it was a turning point. It was a moment, but it was a moment. And one that affected my life.
Well, the world works in mysterious ways, I guess, and that worked out for the best for you. And that's Inappropriate Questions, and that's the podcast. And Mike, you're a legend in this industry, but you're also a survivor. I mean, between Adidas, Amer, all these different things, there's been structure changes, management changes, ownership changes, and through it all, you've thrived in your positions of leadership. And while everything takes a team, it seems like the ones that you have led have always showed unparalleled growth. I mean, look at the SCX changing the industry. You helped build so much with Salomon and Atomic. And it's like all your career decisions turned out to be good ones. And it was an honor to have you on the show. And I thank you for your time.
Well, it's been an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. Look forward to being connected with the industry for a while, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. So thanks.
So that was time with Mike Adams, and it doesn't get any better than what Mike Adams did as far as careers go. And while it started with some kooky looking products, Mike eventually made a huge difference in snow, and he did it all out of the spotlight. There seemed to be zero ego with Mike. He was all business and made a lot of important decisions that helped change brands and an industry for the better. So congrats to Mike on an incredible career. That's the podcast. At this point, it's time for the review of the week, and it's a 5-star review that comes from Blum585. The review is titled Blurring the Lines Between Snow Sports and Dirt Sports. Here it is. Mr. Powell does an excellent job of curating rad interviews about all things snow and dirt, covering everything from the business side of things to the inside scoop with the athletes who are performing for the masses. Keep it up. Nice, short, and sweet, and thank you for that review. While I do a little bit of dirt, I focus mainly on snow, but I appreciate that you noticed that I put Tyler on, and Tyler comes from the dirt side of things. I'll have some mountain bike episodes coming in the fall as well, and one in August, but I'm not going to let you know who that is. You'll find out when that episode drops. But I thank you, Blum585, for that review. It does make me feel good when I get a 5-star review and people think I do an awesome job, so thank you so much for that. Anybody else who wants to write a review, you've heard this podcast plenty of times. You know how to do it. And you know that you will be able to get a beanie if you do. So Blum585, I smell a beanie in your future. And if you email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com with your address, I'll send you one. If anybody else wants a beanie, make a good post on social this week with your favorite episode, and I'll select the best post, read it on the podcast next week, and send you a beanie. So thanks for doing that, and thank you for listening. My final ask is that you check out and support my amazing sponsors. They are Stanley, the 10 Barrel Brewery, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Elan Skis, and Rollerblade. Have a great week, everyone.